Are you overwhelmed by all of the sewing tool options? Are you curious which ones you actually need to get started sewing? Well, if that's the case, then this video is for you. Because while there are a lot of fancy sewing tools out there that can definitely level up your sewing, unlike a Cricut machine, only a few tools are necessary to get started with sewing. So there's no need to worry about all of the other fancy things just yet. That can all come later. So this may seem rather obvious, but the first thing that you need is a sewing machine. Of course, you could try hand sewing everything, but that would be really time consuming and I wouldn't recommend it. If you don't know which sewing machine is right for you, check out my post either here or maybe it's over here, about how to choose the best sewing machine for you. Now, the second most essential tool that you'll need is sewing needles. Now, your machine should come with a starter pack, and that might be all that you need to begin. It usually comes with a couple regular needles and a couple knitting needles. But if you would like more, or your machine did not, then check your manual to see what type of needles you should get. For best performance, stick to choosing needles that your machine is compatible with. Now, there are a lot of variety of needle sizes and types used for different purposes, and it's always a great idea to have multiple ones on hand so that you're ready for whatever sewing project you want to do. Additionally, it's also great to have multiples of each size and type on hand so that you are ready anytime you need to change your needle, which you do actually need to do more often than you might think in order for optimal sewing performance. A couple of the common sizing includes 90/14, 80/11, and 100/16. There are also regular needles. There are needles specifically for denim, for leather, there's heavy duty needles, and there's also needles for knitting, just to name a few. You can find additional sewing machine needles at your sewing machine brand's website and places like Joann Fabrics and Crafts, Walmart, Amazon, Michaels, and Sewing Parts Online. Thirdly, just like sewing machine needles, bobbins are essential to the function of sewing. A bobbin is a small cylindrical piece on which the lower fabric of the machine is wound. It can either be plastic or metal. Your machine will likely come with at least 2 or 3 of these included. Bobbins come in a variety of sizes that are particular to each brand. Tip: for best performance and longevity of your machine, stick to purchasing the size of bobbins that your machine is compatible with.
The wrong size may not even fit.
Additionally, stick with either plastic or metal dependent on what your machine came with, because that's what it's designed for. The wrong material could have a negative impact on the function of your machine. Now, while your sewing machine likely came with a starter pack of bobbin, you will probably need additional bobbins soon, given that you need a different one with each new color of thread. And of course, it's impractical to try to unwind them and reuse them, so you just need to get more bobbins. And they're not that expensive, so that's easy to do. You can find additional bobbins at places like Joann Fabrics and Crafts, Amazon, Walmart, Michaels, and Sewing Parts Online. So obviously, thread is an essential tool in order to be able to sew, but there are different brands and different types of thread that are geared towards specific purposes. So let's go over a few basics and then dive into what you actually need in order just to start sewing. So the first thing to know is that threads come in a variety of weights or thicknesses, you could say. 30 weight, 40 weight, and 50 weight are probably the most common. Now, the first type is all-purpose thread. As the name suggests, all-purpose thread can be used for almost any sewing project. It is normally made of cotton and polyester, and it is suitable for most fabrics, ranging from light to medium weight. It's typically 40 weight. So when do you use all-purpose thread? Well, you use it for basically anything. Unless you need a very specific type of thread, which we'll cover in a minute, then all-purpose thread is suitable for most projects, especially if you're starting out. Another type is heavy-duty thread. Heavy-duty thread is a type of all-purpose thread that is made from a variety of synthetic materials, except it is thicker and is made to withstand greater stress and tension. It comes in a variety of weights and finishes. You should use heavy-duty thread when you're sewing with thicker materials such as denim, leather, or canvas. Tip: because of its thickness, it can sometimes be challenging to sew with. If the material is not suitable for the thickness, it can sometimes bunch up pretty easily. Additionally, you will need to loosen the tension in order to use this thread. Another type is embroidery thread. It is most often made with polyester or rayon and is specifically designed for the decorative designs and adornment created with the embroidery machine. So when should you use it? It is ideal for use with an embroidery machine or when you plan on doing a lot of embroidery. Another type is quilting thread. Just like embroidery thread, quilting thread is designed specifically geared towards quilting. It is often heavier or thicker than regular thread, maybe 40 or 50 weight most commonly, and it is typically made of cotton or polyester. It is also made to withstand the high speeds of a long arm quilting machine. You would use this thread either with a quilting machine or when quilting constitutes the bulk of your sewing. Another type of thread includes specialty threads. These include unique or vibrant threads. This includes types such as metallic, invisible, multicolor, as well as sparkle and holographic. You would use these threads when you want to spice up your sewing or add a little pop to the design on whatever it is you're making. Or in the case of invisible thread, when you don't want to see the thread at all. Tip, just so you're aware, these threads, although very fun, can be quite challenging to sew with sometimes, depending on the thread, of course. It can be difficult to use them in the machine, and they often take extra care and practice. The invisible thread, for example, although it sounds like a really cool idea, is actually kind of a pain to sew with. It's like semi-stretchy, but not quite. It breaks easily. It doesn't move through the machine right.
Honestly, it's more trouble than it's worth.
The last type is stretchy thread. Stretchy thread allows you to sew elastic seams, knit fabrics, and other stretchy fabrics using a base stitch on a normal sewing machine. It is designed to stretch with the fabric. It is best to use this when sewing knit sportswear or gym clothing, swimwear, leotards, or any other instance where the fabric will stretch. Now, there are a lot of different brands of threads, but one of the ones you'll see most typically in stores is Coats & Clark. Others include Gutterman, Metler, Sulky, Maxilock, Scanfil, Singer, Madeira, Beadalon, Dritz, Hildy & Joe, Genome. One of the things to consider while you're purchasing thread is to try to avoid overly cheap thread because it knots, it sometimes breaks, and it can affect the tension of your machine. Another thing to consider when purchasing thread is how the end caps of the thread spool are designed. Traditional thread typically had a flat head with a little hook for the thread. These are still pretty common. However, some now come with end caps, like this one, that snap up and down, allowing you to wrap the thread around the end cap and then snap it inside. Now these are pretty cool because there's no straggling threads left when you put it away. These are also better to sew with because unlike the traditional ones with the exposed hook, there's no exposed hook on these that the thread could potentially get caught on while it's running through the machine. So what do you actually need to get started? I know this can probably seem pretty overwhelming, but don't worry. All that you really need to get started is all-purpose thread. You don't even need to worry about those other types of thread until you're really serious about doing a lot of sewing with either those types of machines or those materials. Fun fact, I almost exclusively use all-purpose thread. Now I've used heavy-duty and specialty threads a couple of times, but they're not something that I would want to sew with regularly because they're a little bit challenging to use and I don't really need them. Personally, I find needle size to be a lot more important than thread type or size. Now if you're just starting out, I would recommend that you get a spool of black and a spool of white all-purpose thread. It's a good idea to have those two colors on hand anyway, and you never know when you're going to need those two most basic colors. I would highly recommend the dual duty all-purpose thread from Coats & Clark that has the snappable end caps, because the snappable end cap allows you to secure the threads easily, and it's better when sewing on the machine because there's nothing that the thread can get caught on. Now you can purchase additional colors of thread as needed, or you can purchase a large thread package / kit that offers a variety of colors so that you'll be ready for almost any project. Now that's how I supplied this thread spool rack here. Purchasing multi-packs can also save you a lot of money because the individual cost of thread spools can really start to add up. They're much more expensive than they used to be. Now the 50 thread pack offers just about every color of thread that you could want to get started with, and will ensure that you have whatever you need whenever you want to start a project. But if you're not ready to commit to that, these multi-packs also come in a pack of 15. This is pretty basic, but you need something to cut fabric with, which can either be scissors or a rotary cutter. Now, if you go with scissors, you're going to need to make sure that they are extremely sharp fabric cutting scissors. Tip, don't use these scissors to cut anything else. If you do, it will dull the blade faster and they won't cut through fabric as easily. Now, some pros to using scissors are that they are relatively inexpensive, they do not require any extra equipment or accessories, and they're relatively easy to transport. Some cons include that they can be harder to cut with, it's more difficult to get smooth, straight cut lines, it can also be harder to cut through multiple layers of fabric. An alternative to scissors is a rotary cutter. What is a rotary cutter, you may ask? Well, a rotary cutter is a fabric cutting tool that has a sharp, round blade that rotates as it's cutting the fabric. It is held with a handle, and it actually looks and operates quite similarly to a pizza cutter. It is extremely sharp, and it can cut multiple layers of fabric at once. Most, if not all, rotary cutters come with a blade protector that slides over the blade when not in use. This helps minimize potential accidents. Now, unlike scissors, the blade has to cut along a surface from the top down. Therefore, if you decide to get a rotary cutter, you will also need a self-healing cutting mat. A self-healing cutting mat is needed so that you have a surface to cut on and do not mess up your table or whatever surface is underneath. They come in a variety of sizes and include helpful measurements and angles. Instead of retaining damages and grooves from cutting, they self-heal, maintaining the smooth cutting surface. Now, although you can find sizes ranging from small to large enough to cover an entire cutting table, the most common sizes include 12 by 18, 18 by 24, and 24 by 36. You should get whatever size makes the most sense for your workspace. Now, if you do get a rotary cutter and mat, I would also recommend that you get a long acrylic ruler. It makes it easier to measure things and to cut straight. You can either purchase this separately or part of a rotary cutting set. Pros of a rotary cutter include that it is easier to use, it can cut through multiple layers of fabric at once, it's easier to get a clean/smooth cut or straight lines, it's easier to cut curves. Cons include that it is more expensive, it requires more accessories, including a self-healing mat and preferably also an acrylic ruler. It's more difficult to transport when you consider the accessories, and it can be somewhat hazardous if you are not careful. You must use extra caution when using a rotary cutter and avoid putting your fingers anywhere near the blade. So which one is better? Personally, if I had to choose just one, I would pick the rotary cutter because I think it's much easier and much faster. However, I would actually recommend that you get both a rotary cutter and a pair of scissors, because there will be times when you need both of them. So where do you get them? You can get a pair of sharp fabric cutting scissors from a craft store like Joann Fabric and Crafts, Michaels, or Hobby Lobby, or online in places like Amazon or Sewing Parts Online, or the sewing sections of Walmart and Target. You can find a rotary cutter, a self-healing mat, and an acrylic ruler at places like Joann Fabrics and Crafts, Sewing Parts Online, Amazon, and possibly Michaels. You can find them either sold separately or as part of a set. Tip: if you opt for getting all three, a set is definitely the best bang for your buck. I'd recommend the Fiskars Rotary Cutter 3-piece set. It comes with an 18 by 24 self-healing mat, which fits perfectly at the end of my sewing table, a 24-inch long acrylic ruler, and of course, the rotary cutter. I've had this since I started sewing. It's super easy to use, it's easy to stay set up, and makes measuring and cutting a breeze. I use the rotary cutter and the ruler all the time. Another item you'll need are pins, sometimes called straight pins or pin needles. Pins are an essential tool for holding fabric together and keeping things in place as you sew. They are also helpful to pin patterns down or to pin something to a model, holding trim in place while you sew, and to mark places in the fabric where you need to start or stop sewing. Without them, sewing things together would likely be a struggle, and you'll have less success achieving a well put together product. The most basic type is a flat head pin. It looks pretty similar to a nail and has a flat head at the top of it, which runs perpendicular to the rest of the pin. They are full metal. Although these are likely a tad cheaper, but not enough to count. These are not super great. Because the head is so flat and small, it is difficult to grip them, and it is hard to get them in and out of fabric. Plus, with so many other more practical options available, there's really no advantage to getting these.
Also, they're ugly and boring.
Another type is T-pins. These pins are also all metal, and they're shaped like a T, with a metal head that runs perpendicular to the rest of the pin at the top. Easier to grip than flat head pins, they are good for securing multiple layers of fabric or for tacking. These can be helpful, but again, there are more exciting and equally practical options available.
Plus, these are also ugly and boring.
Another type is ball head or ball point pins. These are probably the most common type, and I bet you've seen these before. These pins have round balls at the head, and they most often come in different colors. They can either be all metal or they can have plastic heads. You can get them in single color, multicolor packs, pearl, pearlized multicolor, etc. They even come with fun ones like strawberry, skulls, and diamonds. The size of the ballpoint can range from tiny to large. The larger it is, the easier it is to use. You can get a nice starter pack of ballpoint pens, which includes the case below. Another type is decorative flathead pens. These are super fun and cute. Instead of a round ball point at the head, these pens feature a flat head in a particular fun design or shape. There are ones that are shaped like buttons, flowers, hearts, clovers, butterflies, bows, etc. Not only are these cute, but the flathead design is typically larger, which makes them a lot easier to use. Another advantage is the flatness. Because of the flatness, they lay flatter, which means that the fabric doesn't pucker as much when pinning. The button pens are my favorite. I'll put a link to them down in the description below, as well as a link to the flower and heart pens, as well as a variety pack. Another type is these Comfort Grip Magic Pens. These pens have rubber Comfort Grip handles. The rib design of the head makes them softer and easier to grip. In addition to being easier to hold, they also have the advantage of being heat resistant.
So you don't have to worry about the iron with these.
One disadvantage of these is that the grip takes up a slightly larger portion of the pin, which can interfere slightly with pinning. These come in a variety of colors, and you can find ones geared toward a specific type of sewing, ranging from quilting to applique. I've used the fine point patchwork pins from Taylor Seville Originals. This one is also pretty basic, but you'll need a measuring tape or a ruler. You just need to be able to measure things, unless you want to wing it. Also called a Taylor ruler or a soft ruler, measuring tape is extremely affordable and comes in a variety of colors. It's extremely versatile, and it can measure straight lines or around curves, such as around yourself. While there are lots of handy measuring tools and specialty measuring tools out there, if you can only have one, this is the one. It's all you need to get started in the measuring department. Now, you can find a tape measure almost anywhere, but I'd actually recommend the Dritz Sew 101 tape measure. It's really flexible, but also strong. It's a little higher quality and less papery than a lot of the tape measures you might find elsewhere. It doesn't hold creases, which makes it easier to use. I've had it for 7 years and it's held up marvelously. Now, another sewing tool that you're going to want to have starting out is a seam ripper. A seam ripper is a cutting tool that is used for removing or ripping stitches, for separating seams, undoing mistakes, and opening buttonholes. It has a plastic handle with a metal head and what looks like a two-pronged fork with a cutting edge in between the prongs. This tool is essential because you will need it for one of the previously mentioned tasks at some point. At the very least, you will need it to undo stitching when you make a mistake.
And trust me, you will make a mistake.
It happens to the best of us. Often, a small seam ripper is included with the accessories that come with your sewing machine. These are not the easiest to grip because of their size and shape, but they get the job done and are sufficient for when you're starting out. However, if your machine did not come with one or you'd like an upgrade, you can purchase one separately. Now, you might wonder, why would you want an upgrade if the one that comes with your machine is sufficient for starting out? Well, one of the reasons is that seam ripping can cause hand cramps, especially when you have to do a large section at one time. The smaller the seam ripper, the more challenging and uncomfortable it can be after a while. In addition to the basic types of seam rippers, there are ones that come in different sizes, ones with grip handles, ones with covers for the top, and ones that pick up loose threads. Some can be quite fancy. The fancy ones can be a little bit pricier. I think they're well worth it. My personal favorite is the Dritz Seam Fix Seam Ripper.
Boy, that was a tongue twister.
It has a grip handle, a cover that goes over the blade, and it has rubber in each end that picks up straggling thread pieces when you run it over the area you just seamed ripped. If you're interested in upgrading, which your hand may thank you for, I'd highly recommend it. I'll put a link in the description below. Now, the final tool that is a must to sew are hand sewing needles. You might wonder why these would be needed if you have a sewing machine, but there will be things that you need them for that you just cannot do with a sewing machine. One common example of this is sewing buttons. Many machines now come with a presser foot that will allow you to sew the button hole, but most cannot sew the button itself. While some machines are fancy enough to have this capability, not all of them do. And if your machine cannot, then you will have to do them by hand.
This is where those handy sewing needles come in.
You'll also need hand sewing needles for things like snaps, hooks, clasps, and beads and other embellishments. I've also found that there are some places or angles that I just can't get under the sewing machine that I have to end up doing by hand. Now, you can find hand sewing needles basically anywhere. Now, they do come in nice assorted packs so that you can have every size that you need. Many come in a compact storage dial that keeps the needles organized. I do find this one to be helpful. Although any brand is probably fine, I use this one from Loops and Threads, but you can also find one similar to this from Singer and Fiskars. I'll put a link to this one in the description below. All in all, you don't actually need that many sewing tools to get started with sewing. And all of these, with the exception of the machine itself, are all very affordable, especially when starting out. So while there are many cool sewing tools that can make your life easier and more convenient, these can all be added over time. Such tools can add ease and convenience to your sewing, but for the most part are not necessary, especially when starting out. Well, I hope you got some value out of today's video, and if you found this video helpful, please give it a like. Thanks, see you next time. For best performance and longevity, most if not all rotary, especially since you need to change the needle often in order